So it's not about consensus. I think in Canada, we use that term a lot. It's not consensus building. It's basically aligning even if you're not in full agreement. That is what a good product manager does, and that is a key line. It's aligning everyone. You may or may not necessarily agree, but eventually you're basically making sure that you solicit everyone's support for one decision and which is not ambiguous. That is what a good product manager does.
My name's Isabel, and this is your Product Thinking Toolbox. Tarun Babbar is a seasoned product leader with over 14 years of experience at Amazon and startups, with a focus on customer acquisition, product strategy, and managing business growth with P&L responsibilities. Currently, he's serving as a principal product manager at Amazon Ads. Tarun drives cross-functional initiatives to enhance advertiser experiences. Additionally, he co-founded Trekker Warrior, which is a nonprofit dedicated to eliminating non-biodegradable waste from mountainous regions by 2025, which is a really incredible goal. And it also showcases his commitment to environmental sustainability. So welcome to the podcast, Tarun. This is an incredible portfolio that you have.
Thank you. Thank you, Isabel. Excited to be here, and I'm hopeful that I can share some valuable insight from my career with the people who go through this podcast.
Let's dive in, because there's a lot of topics that I'd like to chat with you about today. And let's start with the fact that, like, before we chatted and recorded the session, you mentioned that Amazon has a bunch of leadership principles, like the concepts of like one-way door and two-way door decisions. So I'm going in hot here today. You mentioned those concepts, and I'm really curious to kind of just like set the stage. How do these Amazon leadership principles influence your decision-making process?
Amazon leadership principles, by the way, are very popular, not just in Amazon. I have applied those before I joined Amazon, and I know startups that basically leverage those. And so serious is the company. This is the first time I've come across a company which is very serious about its culture, that those are even upheld during recruitment process. So if I'm basically recommending anyone for a promotion, I have to literally say that this is the leadership principle that the person does really good on. And during the normal recruitment, during even the performance appraisal, if somebody has an area of growth, then that is also linked to a leadership principle. So the company is very serious, and which is why the leadership principles are basically the cultural fabric of Amazon. Now, how are these principles basically used at any point of time, like even hiring, recruitment, performance appraisal, or making decisions on a day-to-day basis? There are 14. Yeah, 14 was the last time that I remember. Sometimes there is some little change that happens, but these leadership principles are essentially created to help everyone make the best decision possible. And the leadership principles basically are designed in, sometimes they have a tension inbuilt in them, which is where Amazon also basically pushes a lot in exercising judgment. Let me give you an example by what I mean. Like, one of the leadership principles is basically bias for action. Whenever we say bias for action, basically what it means is that you have to move fast, and speed is of essence. But at the same time, there is another leadership principle that says deep dive, or leaders think long term. Like, these leadership principles, if you put them together, you're like, hey, should I make a decision quickly, move on, and basically, then see what happens? Or I'm basically supposed to take a step back and do a deep dive and think long term. So the leadership principles, have this inherent tension that is inbuilt into them, which is where the judgment is very important for anyone who works in Amazon, because they have to choose, okay, I'm choosing to basically over-index my decision on this thing, which is I'm going to take a step back because I think it is a significant investment. The decision entails a significant investment. And this is where I think also the concept of, which is very, very frequently used, and this mental model changes the choice of leadership principles that we use, which is one-way door versus two-way door. So if a decision basically has a huge impact on long term, then it is better to over-index on diving deep, thinking long term, taking longer to make a decision, and making the decision finer than to move fast. But if, on the other hand, the decision is largely about, say, just testing two different copies on a landing page to see which one leads to higher conversion rate, then it is actually better if the experiment, given the scale of data, can be concluded in just 1 week or 2 weeks, then it's better to execute it. And as long as it's not causing any kind of a damage, like customer trust is not eroded, it's okay to basically move fast and gather the findings, then to basically keep debating what would be the perfect two versions of copy that need to be tested. So just to summarize my point of view, I think leadership principles are designed to make sure that we are able to make the right decision, and it is on the decision maker to choose the right leadership principle for a specific decision or a set of principles, because not every leadership principle applies in every situation. Choose that and do that exercising good judgment, understanding if it is one-way door, which means largely irreversible, versus two-way door decision, which can be reversed, or the cost of decision or the impact is not going to be so significant that things can change.
I really like that example. I think it was also highlighted in the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And it was about kind of sometimes we tend to over-index on the decisions that are in the two-way door types of decisions. And then we don't think hard enough for the one-way door decision. So are there any kind of mental models that you follow as part of the prior decision making of how do you even identify that it's a one-way or two-way decision, especially sometimes there are projects that are in the gray area of that?
Yeah, I think again, yeah, that's a great question. And I think it takes a while to understand like if a decision is truly one way or two way, because many times teams think that it is a one way door decision, which is when they end up taking longer. But once a leader, looks at it and they says, no, 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 you're not supposed to take so long. This is the cost basically at the worst what will happen. So couple of things that can help in identifying whether a decision is one way versus two way. The first thing is basically the impact. Like, what kind of an impact does the decision have? Like, if it is eroding customer trust for a company like Amazon, that is very serious, which means even if I'm giving an example of two different copies being tested, but if any one of the copies had, say, any legal or a customer trust implication, then even that example will take much longer, because you're trying to test out something and there is any doubt that it could lead to some kind of erosion of customer trust. That's one. So always look at the impact. Then look at, the second thing that can be looked upon is there any kind of, for a bigger company, it becomes more important, which is legal implications or, any kind of negative publicity. Publicity is also linked to customer trust, but legal implications, again, for larger companies, it becomes all the more important. Even for smaller companies, you don't want to basically deal with the regulators, but legal implications are important. The third one could be basically, does it lead to any kind of situation wherein you could end up losing your market share? Which a good example could be a company which is trying to say completely overhaul a product. They say, instead of X, we'll do Y, or we had product A, now we are going to deprecate it and launch something completely new. For example, Google Podcast has now come with a decision that they will deprecate Google Podcast, and everything will be on YouTube. It's a big decision. I'm absolutely sure. I don't know how they basically have made that decision, but the decision seems almost like a one-way door decision. It's a perfect example of a one-way door decision, because once you deprecate an app, because it would take such a long time, there is a learning curve for the customers, and then the customers would basically some customers may not even move to YouTube. They will say, I would rather use Spotify to listen to my podcast, or I would rather use my Apple's inbuilt app for basically listening to the podcast. So some decisions, this is a very good example. Like Google's decision to move to YouTube is a perfect example of a one-way door decision. But a two-way door decision could be, changing certain things like a minor color change. That could be a two-way door decision. If things don't work out, at the worst, you could bring it back. So I think the impact is the number one thing that has to be looked upon. And that could be broken down into many different buckets. Like I said, customer trust, regulatory pressure, or it could be market share. There could be others as well. The money also could be an important factor. Like if it's a very costly proposal, then also it tends to become one-way door decision, like setting up a big plant. Like again, these principles do not necessarily apply just to tech companies. They could also apply to, traditional industries. Like if I'm a factory owner, my decision to basically, buy certain kind of machinery and not buy the other kind of machinery is actually very close to a one-way door decision, if not entirely one-way door decision, right? So that's how the decision maker needs to think about it, and it could be at different levels. Other thing that is very important for one-way versus two-way door decision is so impact is one, and the second is basically the cost, like how costly the decision is, which I tried to briefly allude to. Basically, if it is a significant investment of resources or not, then that also basically tends to be an indicator of where the decision would be. For example, for a software development team, if I'm the product owner, And if I'm basically making a decision and I know that my cycles are annual to deliver a product, if I say that I'm making a decision to invest 80% of my team for 9 months out of 12 months into a specific product feature, it is a one-way door decision for my team. Now, this is interesting for a director. It may or may not be one way versus, I mean, it may not be one way door because there are many teams. So they could look at things differently. So scope, authority. Again, what I'm trying to show here is the complexity of decision making. It is the responsibility of the decision maker to simplify and see things from their perspective. But for everyone, depending upon their horizon, a decision could be one way versus two way, and it is our responsibility to see it that way clearly with the cost and the impact.
I'm actually more curious about kind of that relationship between the two. So when you're telling me all of these examples, it almost stands out to me that the fact that there are some huge one-way door decisions. Like, for example, you said the 9-month example. That's like a one-way decision. But
Right.
within that 9 months, there could be some micro two-way decisions as well that you can make to make a bigger bet in that one-way decision, right?
Yeah, that's a very good observation you have. So I can give you an example. So between even with in this example of say a 9-month taking project wherein most of my engineering team is going to work on it, it is one way for my team, my little organization. It's a one-way door decision because we've exhausted all the resources. But within that, we will face frequently choices at each individual's level, which is where Amazon's principles are so interesting and so important. So software management engineer, software development manager, they will face a decision, what should be the architecture. Now, do you want to invest on an architecture which is basically, I need to basically build the best architecture thinking 3 years, or I am basically going to say, hey, this is the most important element where I need to really invest, but there are 3 decoupled pieces. One of those decoupled pieces, I can just, try to make whatever does the job for next 6 months to 1 year. And if there is scale, then I will basically invest more resources on it because I see the risk of timelines going over the commitment. So then, each person basically at their level could be making certain decisions, which could be about design choices for the architecture. It could be about certain kind of feature trade-offs. Like I might say, hey, I would rather do this feature instead of that feature. And I know this is not going to cause permanent damage because generally, as is the nature of, each project, when we go deeper, we realize that there are many more parts wherein, there is inherent tension that how much do you want to invest on it? What should be the approach? So teams do have to, or individuals do go through that process, depending upon what is the scope that they're responsible for.
That makes sense. And that kind of applies to almost your career trajectory. So I would like to kind of double click into that because you previously were doing growth, right? And now you're doing more of a platform type of product management. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
So with that, there's almost like I'm trying to find the word for it, it's almost like an oxymoron sometimes when you think like growth versus platform, right? Because growth product management, you think it's like fast two-way door decisions, ship quickly, learn quickly, iterate quickly. But then you have the platform piece, which is like infrastructure, tech stack. So what has that kind of like mental model helped impact that journey for you in terms of your career?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. The mental models slightly changed, but I think one thing that helped me operate in either team, and that I think is an advice for any product manager, or for that matter, I would say anyone working in any role across the organization, you can never go wrong, is to have as much as possible customer centricity. So I always felt that, love for understanding the customers better, or there was almost a passion for always understanding the customer's problem and solving for those. That was basically what I always had as my almost like a governing statement of my career. So in growth, what it meant was reducing the friction. Like if I am basically targeting certain customers, they're abandoning cart, how do we do that quickly? How do we send them a reminder? Or how do we make sure that we are giving them the right coupon so that they can make a transaction? Or what kind of automation do we need to build so that whatever we have experimented upon and is working, say notifications. Now, what automation is required to basically scale that to tens of millions of users? So generally, it was about reducing the friction. And to your point, growth is a lot about understanding the funnel and making sure that each stage of the funnel, you're able to move customers faster to the next phase and as many customers as possible. That's basically at a highest level what is a growth PM would do. They would run experiment, they would figure it out, and then they would automate it. Now, what I learned that while the customer centricity and solving problems helps, In a platform team, the key mission statements evolve and they become slightly bigger. Like, it's not just about reducing the friction, but it's also about other things. Let me give you an example. Like for a platform team, things that are really important is reliability. Like number one thing, is your platform reliable? Then second thing, the customers that you're dealing with, there would be many different segments. For a growth team, it is largely the end customer who is paying for your product or service. For a platform team, your customers are also those that are building for the end customer. It could be internal teams, it could be developers. And nowadays there are so many interesting big tech companies that have such a large developer community. So anyone who is basically responsible for a product that caters to the developer community is also a platform team product manager. So this is the second, that's the other piece of customer segment. And then there could also be internal teams sometimes, which is not just developers, but internal teams that are building on top of the platform that you've built to do certain things. A good example could be if a company has basically built a very nice product for fraud detection or say identification of customers. Let's, for example, because I don't want to quote anything which is sensitive, let's take very general examples like Amazon. Sorry, Google, not Amazon. Let's take the example of Google. Google has this single sign-on, right? The single sign-on is used in so many places, like not just for logging in Gmail, but nowadays, any company that wants basically login, they allow logging in via Google account, right? So that product, that authentication or the user credentials being verified and somebody being able to create an account and being able to access an account with any website, whether it is a music website or it is an e-commerce website or it is Gmail, that is a platform. So it is catering to so many different teams, not just within Google, but it's also catering to some developers who are trying to build something on top of it, and basically to other companies that are building products on top of it. So it's a good example of a platform. Now, things for platforms that become very, very important is reliability, ease of use, and what is basically, your overall service availability, which means performance. So performance should be good, you should be dependable, and you should be easy to work with, which, as a subcategory of that, it could be the right kind of documentation and good videos or the content. So platform teams, it becomes very important that, even if you don't have immediate revenue impact, which in some cases there could be, because the platform team that I work on, it has a revenue impact as well, because I deal with end customers and I deal with internal teams, I deal with developers, there's all these different segments. But what really becomes important is that you have to understand the needs of each of them and be able to basically build a reliable, dependable, scalable platform that caters to their need. So you have to understand those metrics and be able to translate that to what your overall product strategy should be, that it end up becoming largely driven by the engineers. Like compared to very consumer-centric products, platform products have a heavy component of engineering that you need to work very closely with.
Yeah, revenue impact is such a tricky thing, right? Like, especially when we think about what is the impact of the work that I'm doing. And then when you look at, for example, growth, it's pretty straightforward because you have the clear value metric that you need to move for specific customers. And then you basically try to tackle that with like proxy metrics to help kind of see if it moves it or not. But then with like platform type of products, and again, I'm not too familiar because I've never really done platform product building before, but when you look at revenue impact in itself, how do you assess kind of that ultimate impact on the bottom line? Do you look at more of cost savings or do you look at more of the generation of new revenue?
I think the platform team, you're right, identifying the metrics becomes generally harder. So there are two things that become very important, like very solid two frameworks or two different type of metrics. One, velocity. I did not talk about that in the previous answer, but for platform teams, how fast do you enable someone to do what they're supposed to do or what they're planning to do? Basically, what it leads to is speed of launching new features. So if you've built a good platform, then other teams can launch features faster using what you've built. Or other developers outside your company will be able to build products much faster and be able to basically serve the customer. So that's one, you make sure that you try to measure that. And the second is basically your derived revenue from whatever you're building. So you still want to make sure that you're prioritizing things for the end customer, which is where platform product management is slightly hard because you're a couple of degrees away from the end customer. But what you still do is from these all the different customer segments or user segments that you're catering to, you try and understand whose problem will have the largest impact. So you still apply the conventional framework, where am I having the maximum impact? What am I trying to solve for? And then you say, okay, of all the customer segments that I'm catering to right now, the user segments for my platform, I see that, this user segment is going to build something for the end customer. And this seems to be the most scaled up impact I could derive. Hence, I'm going to optimize my decisions around this feature as being the P0 or the highest priority. So you still look at the revenue or the impact, but the only problem is that you have to do it a couple of degrees of calculation, and then you think about the speed with which other people are able to build things on your platform.
So I'm actually now curious about kind of your transition from launching a product to or launching products to leading a platform team for larger organizations. Do you feel like there are key differences from that transition of leading those teams, specifically between small scale organizations to large scale organizations?
Yes. So platform teams, I think generally I've built my career being very close to customers. So I think, to be honest, it almost is like a shock when you try to own a platform team, because the same mental models have to be really evolved. It becomes slightly more complex because previously you work directly with the customers. Now your customer is somebody else or your user is somebody else, and you have to basically get the insights from them. So it requires basically being able to deal with that complexity, because it's not going to be as straightforward as previously. And then the second thing is, I think the metrics through which you measure success of your product initiatives ends up becoming slightly more challenging. Calculating what would lead to what is sometimes harder, because it can become even further harder that many teams that you cater to are not going to basically take on directly revenue generating initiatives, or many of the users that you're catering to may not have revenue generating impact. It could simply be about, hey, we need feature X so that we can do it easily, which is where the velocity argument comes. So I think it's net, it's about the mental models have to shift a lot. You will think either about the velocity, which can be broken down into ease, speed, etc., and how easily you make it understood, or basically you have to think about the customer impact. So net, it just becomes a bit more complex, and you have to evolve your thinking if you have to be a platform PM from just basically dealing with one customer segment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then pivoting to that growth growth product mindset, because you've had a lot of experience doing that too. What were your challenges that you faced specifically maybe in your first year or the first even couple of quarters when launching a new product from scratch? Because that's usually also kind of the cold start problem, which is a lot more of a different problem. How do you approach that perspective into revenue growth?
Growth PMs typically tend to work on very short-term initiatives, which means experiments that have to be rolled out immediately, as well as they have to think about the long-term bets that their organization may have to make, including the engineering orgs that may have to support them. So for a growth team, I think it's very important to set the right kind of a framework on the basis of which both these priorities would be balanced, which means how are you going to shortlist the kind of experiments that you would be running? So setting that framework up, that, for example, if I've got certain marketing channels such as push notifications and emails available to me, which actually was the case when I took ownership of customer retention and product at Snapdeal, which is an e-commerce marketplace in India. And I had to basically figure out that I have multiple channels: customer loyalty, text messages, emails, and push notification at some point. What is my strategy going to be, and how I'm going to balance my short term versus long term? Because the more experiments we are doing, the leadership and sometimes stakeholders can think there is a lot of work happening, a lot of action, which is important. But I also have to think about setting up fundamental things right, which means what would be the customer segmentation? How do we make sure that we are not spamming customers? How do we make sure that if we are giving discount coupons, then we are not wasting our money, because I was already going to buy, then why are you giving me money, right? Like, there are some hard questions. So trying to set a framework and figuring out how am I going to balance these things. If anyone is basically joining this, trying to become a growth PM, they have to, at their level, my scope was different. I had a lot more available, including a team and different channels. But depending upon the scope and what you're responsible for, being able to balance short-term versus long-term is important. So from my side, I think reflecting upon my time, I try to basically balance that, hey, these are the experiments where we have unknown, but I would not direct my team just on running experiments. So I was very clear that I have to set things correct. If there were issues to do with certain things that were already proven and they have to be automated because we need to scale them, then that is where I started working on, which means it was a technology decision. But where I had to basically think about that these are unknowns. Do these kind of notifications work or not work? Can we increase the frequency? Those were largely experiment driven ideas. So I tried to balance these two. But generally, my nature was to always think about long term. So I tried to over index, like 70% of my time generally went on, 60% of my time generally went on doing the long term things, which means setting up the right segmentation framework, running experiments to prove efficacy of certain channels. Like I figured out, for example, that sending a text message does not help at all in driving additional orders because these customers were already receiving push notifications. So there was a lot of cost of sending text messages, and then the regulatory compliance, etc. Because you cannot spam customers. So I realized that push notifications alone, they were the best, a channel that we could use in any way. But text messages were not good. So I very quickly tried to prove it, and that helped. So growth, basically, just to summarize, you have to always think about short term versus long term. Short term is about velocity of experiments. Long term is about setting up the right house in order, which means the automation that you have, the right kind of segmentation, what tools you would use, what technology would you have. Those are the things that somebody has to think about long term as a growth PM.
Yeah, that's a really good perspective because sometimes when we think about like growth product, and I myself included, it's like we got to prove or disprove something ASAP, but we don't actually think about the long-term kind of infrastructure that we're setting it up for. There is a statement that was recently talked about in internally, which was like growth teams do not build features, they build levers. Do you agree or disagree with this statement?
I think taking one stance here would be hard. I agree that levers are very important, but do they build features? I think more time should go on levers. I would say that yes, features may be important, but less. I think it's more about spending time on identifying the right levers so that you can modulate the overall growth. But in certain cases, it could also be features. But I kind of agree that it's more levers than features. But to say a binary answer, I think will be slightly hard to be.
It's tricky, right? Yeah, because it's like when you think about just like product as a whole, there is always the question about ownership and when do you pass the puck? And especially when I'm actually curious from a platform perspective too, it's like, when do you pass the puck? Because sometimes it's super easy to say, well, a platform team basically focuses on a wide range of the system. When does it come to the ownership of the specific feature teams?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think for the ownership, I think the most important thing that one should be asking is who is going to be most impacted. I understand that the customers are going to be always most impacted from any decision that we make. But from a feature perspective, if I have to make a decision, and I say that, hey, this feature I'm going to retain in my portfolio and I will basically, I'm the right owner. But somebody else basically has a goal to do something and when they should be having control of that feature because it could be a lever for them, then they are the right team to own this. So it comes down to basically who's going to be most impacted, how the incentives are structured in an organization. If incentives are basically in favor of somebody else through the use of that feature because it is a lever for them, then that is the other team that should be owning it. And then there are sometimes additional considerations. It's not as straightforward. Well, this is the level one answer. The level two answer could be the other team is going to be impacted, but they don't have the competency to operate it. I have the competency, but I'm not the most impacted party, but teams could agree to work together wherein I'm going to allocate my engineering resources because I know I have the competency and I can work together with them to overall improve the outcome. So there are many ways, but largely it comes down to who's going to be most impacted, who's going to be incentivized. The second level of question to ask is who has the right strength or competency to operate that? Because one feature could be a level for someone, ideally should be with them, but they should be the rightful competent team or people as well.
That's a really good point. Speaking of core competencies, I'm going to shift gears given that we are almost at time about your background, because you have had a background with business development, coding, and then now product management. How has that influenced your career trajectory? How do you leverage all these diverse skill sets, because they're completely kind of different skill sets in your current role?
I think one thing I've learned about myself that I'm a very good journalist, which means I tend to understand about so many different industries, different roles. So that is what my career trajectory has equipped me with. That because I've done so many different things in different type of companies and different scales, I'm generally able to adjust very quickly in any context. But I think over a period of time, because in the beginning I probably did not have a really good sense of where I'm headed. Like I had an idea about what should be my next step. Like right out of my university, I knew that I want to basically do something which gives me a greater exposure of different businesses, and I should be able to solve for not just one company but maybe different companies. Hence, a business development role really made sense. So that was the only clarity I had. But as I pivoted to growth, it was because after my MBA, I joined eBay. I understood the role of data, and I understood basically, that teams could make better decisions using data and they could grow much faster through this experimentation framework. So that became quite clear to me. But I think one thing which was always there was that I really liked the idea of creating better products. Like I didn't want to just basically, for example, promote a shitty product through whatever growth levers you have. You really want to promote the right product, which is doing something good. So that was always there, which is where the move to product management was conscious. And now I know my next move also that at some point I want to move into sustainability space because that is something which drives me. So I think identifying what drives you is very important. In general, it's a better idea to figure out at least one area where you have good competency. That's my advice to any younger professional or even someone who's basically in the mid stage. But you should basically still listen to what your inner self tells you to do.
Which I'm now going to pose a hard question to you because we get a lot of kind of ask from non-product folks about wanting to join product management. But what are the misconceptions do you think people often have about decision making as a product manager, and how do you address them?
Yeah, that's my favorite topic as well because I've also made many mistakes at different scales and different contexts. I think people like the idea of product management because all of us are naturally critiques, or many of us are naturally critiques. We see something, oh yeah, this could be designed better, that could be done. And I think, the influence of easy availability of information, social media have only amplified it. Like we are now exposed to so many different things. So we tend to have a lot more viewpoints about different things. Some people think that, therefore they think that they could be good product managers. That's one. Again, it's a very general theory. I can't point specifics because product managers are also very well paid. So there are many more factors, but I was just basically talking about a behavioral thing here. I think one big misconception that people have about product management is that they own the decisions, which means they think that they will be the one who will make the decision because this cup I do not like for certain reasons. I find it difficult to hold it with my whole hand. I'm going to redesign the cup because I'm a better product manager and I will make sure that the assembly line, manufacturers, whatever, I will make sure that they follow my decision. It doesn't work that way. So that's the single biggest misconception people have. You are the product owner, you are the product manager, but it doesn't mean that you own all the decisions. You're only facilitating the best decision at a point of time with the resources and stakeholders that you've got. That's basically what a product manager does. What it means is that they're influencing everyone and bringing people together from different teams and making sure that the resources are allocated for the best decision at a given point of time with the constraints that are designed. As a product owner, even at in a company like Amazon, where I'm a platform PM, a principal product manager, which is a high scope position, it doesn't mean that I own all the decisions. All I do is basically I have to influence to make the right decisions with different team members. So that's the number one misconception people have, that they own the decision end to end. That's not true. We can go deeper into influence and what are the different levels, but I'll take a pause here.
That made me just chuckle in general because I think there's always a misquote about how the product manager is the CEO of the product. And I see you smiling because that is something that I think most PMs don't like hearing.
They don't.
But tell me more why you, Tarun, don't disagree with that statement, if you do.
Yeah. So I don't, I mean, PMs are not necessarily just the CEOs, and I've never been a CEO, so I don't fully understand, how hard is a job to be a CEO. I think I presume that even for a CEO, sometimes they are also going through something similar. But anyway, I'll break it down. Like for a PM, what are the important skills? Why they are not the end-to-end decision owner? Even though they are the ones who are, if anything goes wrong or right, they're the ones who basically get the credit. But let's break it down. What does it mean to be a good decision maker, or what does it mean to influence for the right decision? I think the nature of product management is just like for a CEO, you're working with various stakeholder groups who have different incentives, who have different viewpoints. Like I said, that all of us have a natural critique inside us. So they have different incentives, they have different goals. Their resources could be allocated to certain things. Like in a larger organization, what it means is that there are different teams who are developing different type of features or products. Bringing them together becomes much harder. So what do? You really have to make sure that your stakeholders are being heard. That becomes very, very important. So you can't make a decision in isolation. You want to make sure that anyone who has got a viewpoint, and if they're important to the project or the product, you bring them on board and you make sure that you're giving them an opportunity to be heard. That's one. Second thing is, it becomes very important to align, because the resources and the priorities could be very different, which is where a good product manager versus a bad product manager, or a product manager who is in progress to become a good product manager, that's where the difference comes. That you're able to align them. And how do you do that? You do that by basically communicating very transparently. You're able to explain, you're able to rationalize why you're basically pursuing certain goals and why they should team up. So that becomes very important. Communicating and being able to rationalize and bring other people on board to your idea is important. And in the process, making changes to your decisions, making them better, or recrafting certain things, or changing certain features, or whatever that is important, so that it basically becomes a net a better decision. Third thing is, when basically you have to change, I think I slightly talked about it, you're willing to change. So you come across as flexible, and it is not that you are basically saying, hey, I need to do this, I explained to you, now basically you have to support me. It's not that. So show that flexibility, and make sure that as a product manager, you're able to align people towards a greater goal. Now, I think this is where the CEO role also comes, and also for a good product manager, which is what happens when there is a deadlock. Like, you heard the person, you communicated transparently, you try to align them, their priorities are different. And you also made sure that it is not very personal, very important. Like, the decision and the person are different. They're not the same. So you make sure that you talk about the decision or talk about the initiative, rather than saying, hey, this team is bad or that person is bad. Very important for a good product manager, or even a project manager, by the way, that you're basically seeing things very different. Don't make it personal. Now, even after all these things, and these are the recipes or ingredients for good influence, how do you break the deadlock? So then, you have to use the right mechanism to move the group forward. Like, even if there are, say, 100 people, 20 people are not supporting you, then even then, how do you make the decision? And you basically try to instill confidence that, hey, we are making a decision to go ahead with this, even if we have a disagreement, but we still want to go ahead. And we know that you're not aligned, or we know that you're not in agreement. But right now, I need you to basically support me, because right now, this is the only path forward. So it's not about consensus. I think in Canada, we use that term a lot. It's not consensus building. It's basically aligning, even if you're not in full agreement. That is what a good product manager does. And that is a key line. It's aligning everyone. You may or may not necessarily agree, but eventually you're basically making sure that you solicit everyone's support for one decision, and which is not ambiguous. That is what a good product manager does.
I love it. What a way to conclude today's episode. Actually, before we do that, I'm going to fire 3 rapid fire questions for you.
Sure.
Did not prepare you at all for this, but number 1, what's a favorite product you're using as of late?
Favorite product. I think my favorite product is, to be honest, Pocket app on my mobile device. I just hate the idea of seeing so many advertisements on any web page that I've used, especially on the mobile browser. The experience is very bad. So what I normally do is I save any web page or an article in Pocket app, and either I can listen to it or I can read it, and it is basically a distraction-free environment for me. So for many years, I've basically been a very pro user of Pocket app because it allows me to hit my reading goals.
I have never heard of that. I'm gonna check it out. That's
Sure.
cool. What's a book that you're reading right now?
The book that I'm reading, I recently, in fact, just completed. And the book is about Stoicism, A Guide to Good Life. I can tell you the name of the author also.
It's funny because I have recently been reading a book called How to Think Like a Roman Emperor by Marcus Aurelius.
Marcus Aurelius. Yeah.
Aurelius, yeah.
So the book that I'm reading is almost finished, just finished, by the way, A Guide to Good Life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy. It's by this author called William B. Irwin. And the book basically consolidates findings from different schools of Stoicism and, gives you some really good tools and mental models, basically how to. So that's the book that I just finished.
Very interesting. And what is one thing that you do in your morning routine that you must do every single day without fail?
Assuming that we're talking anything besides having a tea, right?
Okay, so it's having a tea.
I have a tea, but the other thing that I normally do is I always step out for a small walk. I have a beautiful trail next to my house. So it's normally basically a 10-minute walk that I do every morning just to get some fresh air, right? After having tea, just to awaken my senses and also basically, think about what am I going to do throughout my day or what is it that I want to achieve in the day.
Sweet. And where can everyone find you, Tarun, if they have questions or they want to just learn more about you?
I think the best place to connect is at this point LinkedIn. I'm not that good with content creation. I think I've thought about it a couple of times that I need to publish more often, maybe on Twitter, etc. But at this point, the best place to connect is LinkedIn.
Sounds good. Thanks, Tarun, for your help and your thoughts and just like the lessons that you've shared with us today. Today's a really insightful one.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And it was lovely chatting with you.